In post-war West Berlin of the 1950s, there were many changes, primarily political. The existence of the Communist Party was banned, and the political course was oriented towards the Western Allies. French, British, and American goods began to appear in the country. Unlike the communist neighbor, democracy thrived here. Although not for long. In the mid-1950s, the government passed several controversial laws that not only contradicted the constitution but also echoed the principles of the former Nazi Germany.
There were courts that oppressed human rights, bans on holding rallies and protests. The authorities issued a mandate for compulsory labor for nearly all women and men. The government concentrated almost unlimited power in its hands.
These laws caused a very mixed reaction among the population, mostly within student circles. Young people began to protest. The late 60s in Germany were marked by constant demonstrations, which eventually led to the formation of the left-wing radical terrorist group known as the RAF, the Red Army faction. They have become a symbol of terrorism in Germany. This story is not about intelligence agencies, but about the guilt and inaction. The RAF emerged thanks to the Stasi, existed thanks to the KGB, and carried out terrorist attacks due to the inability of the FRG's intelligence services to control the situation. These are the 1967 protests in Berlin against the visit of the Iranian Shah, Mohammad Pahlavi. The protesters did not want him in their country due to his ties with the United States. In the eyes of the students, the US and its capitalism appeared as enemies. For several reasons. The first reason was that they believed capitalism turns people into powerless pigs, endlessly running in a wheel just to pay for rent, food, clothing, and so on. The second reason was the war in Vietnam. Most of the protests were against the war. On June 2, 1967, at one of these protests, student Benno Ohnesorg was killed. This tragedy became the catalyst for the creation of the RAF group. Around this time, Andreas Baader and his girlfriend Gudrun Enseling, students, emerged as the founders and leaders of the RAF. On April 2, 1968, in Frankfurt am Main, together with associates they set fire to 2 supermarkets. According to them, they brought the fire of Vietnam to Germany and avenged the death of Ohnesorg. It was then that Germans first encountered the RAF.
They brought only a small part of what the Americans had dropped on Vietnam. They wanted to show how scared people can be. They said, "You're worried about a small fire in a store, where clothes are burning, but look at what's happening every day in Vietnam. What kind of people are you? Are you even human?"
The police caught the arsonists within just 2 days. They acted carelessly, leaving a bunch of prints and traces. When they were brought to trial as a protest against the US and the German government, Andreas Baader greeted the judge with a Nazi salute. The 4 defendants turned the trial into a series of provocations, constantly displaying disrespect.
We wanted to be part of the global youth movement with music, protests, new ideas. We despised what our parents had built. We didn't want to live with our past. We wanted to be the driving force of the revolution.
In 1970, Ulrike Meinhof entered the history of the RAF. A young journalist who mostly wrote about the country's political life. She became deeply intrigued by the idea of Andreas Baader and his associates' struggle. So Ulrike agreed with law enforcement officers to interview him. However, under the guise of journalistic interest, Meinhof aimed to join the ranks of the terrorists. Interestingly, the intelligence agencies didn't notice this. Despite regularly criticizing the government and political course in her articles, in May 1970, Baader was brought to the Berlin Institute of Social Research, where Ulrike was already waiting for him. Their conversation took place surrounded by security. But just a few minutes into their conversation, armed men stormed the building and began a shootout. Ulrike and Baader disappeared. Since then, terror has begun.
Their rhetoric was pseudo-Marxist. They saw themselves as revolutionaries who could turn everything upside down. They were little concerned about what it might lead to. They were young people full of energy but lacking in wisdom.
In 1970, the RAF started by addressing logistical issues. They needed money, weapons and transport. And the easiest way to do this was by robbing banks, stores, and stealing cars. The irony was that, while fighting against capitalism, which they believed exploited people for money, they themselves were stealing the money that Germans had deposited in banks. But they had an answer to that.
We robbed banks. It was an ordinary robbery, not a political one. It was just a method of acquiring money. We weren't stealing from old women on the streets.
The RAF, or the Baader-Meinhof Group, was part of a global trend that emerged in the 1970s in West Germany. A trend of the Marxist vanguard, the Red Brigades in Italy or the Red Army in Japan. Even in the US, there were such. They believed the capitalist system was evil and must be destroyed. They thought the only way to do this was through violence.
The RAF fought capitalism using guerrilla tactics. To learn these tactics, in 1970, they traveled to Jordan, contacting the Palestine Liberation Organization, a terrorist group that aimed to erase Israel from the map. They taught them almost everything they knew. Again, knowing who the RAF were, familiar with their ideas and methods, the intelligence agencies didn't bat an eye, allowing them to travel abroad. They returned, already trained and ready to put their lessons into practice.
The training didn't cover urban combat. Running in open fields or crawling under barbed wire is nothing like fighting in a city. When it came to weapons, it was good training. We were trained in weapons and explosives. It was helpful.
The first attacks with explosives began in 1972, a bloody year for Germany. RAF members carried out a series of attacks on American diplomatic missions, defense buildings, and bases. Having learned combat tactics and bomb-making methods, they brought terrorism to Germany. In their attacks, 4 people were killed and at least 30 were injured.
On May 11, 1972, RAF members exploded 3 bombs near the IG Farben building. The building was damaged. This was the first bombing attack by the RAF in the beginning of the so-called May Offensive, during which they carried out 5 more attacks.
The terrorist attacks were a wake-up call for both the government and law enforcement. They were immediately hunted, fearing that sooner or later a new wave of attacks would begin. They were found through a simple method. An old neighbor, who lived next to the garage headquarters, tipped him off. One call, and police were there.
They wanted to change our society and state towards socialism, but through violence. And from the very beginning of their activities, we knew that thanks to our law enforcement system, they would not succeed.
Heavy armored vehicles arrived at the headquarters. Some members surrendered, while others opened fire. It was useless to resist. Andreas Baader remained in the garage, refusing to come out. He was pulled out by force. The officers involved in the raid recalled that he screamed like a pig as they shoved him into the police car. All of them were scattered in prisons in Western Germany. They were not allowed to communicate with anyone and were kept in solitary confinement. They had radios and books. However, neither books nor music could replace real human interaction. Moreover, they were confined to 4 walls for 23.5 hours a day, with only 30 minutes for a walk outside to stretch their legs.
They were isolated from other prisoners. They were placed in solitary cells. It was normal. However, it was abnormal that they were cut off from everything else. Also, the court prohibited correspondence and visits, except for relatives and lawyers. Thus began the first steps of their isolation.
The prisoners went on a hunger strike. They demanded access to other prisoners and the right to communicate with each other. They also wanted recognition as political prisoners. But the government remained firm. As a result, Holger Mainz died from hunger. Force feeding began. RAF members were fed through medical procedures.
By 1972, the entire generation of RAF founders was behind bars. So the second and third generations appeared. Why? Due to state-organized terror and detention conditions.
Meanwhile, it was 1975. The second generation of the RAF, demanding the release of Meinhof, Baader and other group members, seized the West German embassy in Stockholm. 3 people were killed and 30 were injured. All because of an accidental explosion. The bomb planted by the terrorists in the embassy detonated accidentally, due to panic, as the building had been surrounded by police, the army, and a whole array of armored vehicles. On May 9, 1976, Ulrike Meinhof was found dead in her cell. The official version was suicide. She allegedly braided a rope and hanged herself. However, her death still leaves many questions. After all, the ceiling in the cell was so high that attaching a rope to it was impossible. Former RAF members believe that she was ordered killed by state leaders or intelligence agencies. Nevertheless, it remains a mystery, as does her involvement in the group. Even members didn't always understand her role in the RAF.
I don't understand how Baader kept women in his circle. He called his girlfriend Gudrun Ensslin stupid, and he called Ulrike Meinhof really stupid.
On September 5, 1977, with a new demand to release the RAF leaders, members of the second generation took former SS officer Hans-Martin Schleyer hostage. He was kept chained to the wall, with his video message broadcast to the entire country. The terrorists made it clear, if Baader and his group were not released, Schleyer would not leave alive.
These were the first people since Nazi Germany to engage in political terrorism. Moreover, they encouraged others to participate. If you want to judge them morally, their moral equivalent is identical to the Nazis. The video they broadcast to the whole country just drove me crazy. I wanted to vomit. It only increased my desire to destroy these people.
Schleyer's retention did not yield results, so the terrorists went further. Contacting the Palestine Liberation Organization, they hijacked an entire plane, the Lufthansa Landshut. It was landed in Somalia. 90 people were trapped. People knew that if the demands weren't met, it would be the end for them.
The 70s were a huge era of air travel. You could easily walk to the terminal or even onto the plane. No one checked your passport or bag, or asked who you were.
After landing the plane in Somalia, the terrorists waited for the demands to be met. In response, the German government sent the GSG-9 rescue unit, a special task force created after the death of Israeli athletes in Munich in 1972. In 7 minutes, they cleared the plane and rescued the hostages. The terrorists understood that they had lost. The hijacking was their last chance to secure the release of the RAF leaders. After so many failed attempts to free the prisoners, the bodies of Andreas Baader, Gudrun Ensslin, and Jan Karl Raspe were found lifeless in their cells. Ensslin hanged herself on an electric cable. Baader and Raspe allegedly shot themselves with pistols. However, former RAF members don't believe this, as smuggling weapons into a maximum security prison was impossible. There was always security near the RAF prisoners' cells. The official version was suicide. The case was never investigated further. On October 19, Hans-Martin Schleyer was found dead in a car on the Charles de Gaulle highway. He was riddled with bullets by the second generation of the RAF. There is a theory that the RAF was funded and supported by the KGB. After 1977, West Germany passed numerous anti-terrorism laws. The group members had to flee to neighboring Germany. In East Germany, they were given shelter and new passports with new names. Although there is no official version linking Moscow to the RAF, former pro-Kremlin intelligence agents have repeatedly said it was the work of the KGB. However, the group's peak was in the 1970s. After that, the terror continued. The new members committed at least 15 more terrorist attacks. And in 1998, the RAF announced its self-dissolution. This is how their story ended, doomed to defeat from the very beginning. The RAF leaders said this themselves. As Ulrike Meinhof said, we were too naive and not politically savvy enough. We defended the bourgeois constitution from the bourgeoisie instead of fighting the power of the bourgeoisie. This tactic is doomed to failure.